I stand before the circle today to review the bill that is before us, which would be the second and final go-round on the subject of no excuse absentee voting. For those watching, there is a process that we follow to make constitutional amendments in Connecticut, and that is that if we are going to make an amendment to our Constitution, it has to make it through the legislature first before it goes to the voters. And the process for it to go through the legislature is that the provision has to pass both chambers, I think by a 3/4 vote in one legislative cycle, and then it would go on to the voters. If that fails to happen, then it has to at least make a 50% plus one vote plurality in each chamber, and then it earns the right to be voted on again in a subsequent legislature, basically after the next election. It could happen in either year. And that's the position that we are in today. And we are in that position today because the last time that we voted on this more or less exact resolution, the resolution failed to reach the 75% threshold, but it did reach the 50% threshold. And I'll just start right here by explaining that the reason why it didn't reach the 75% threshold is because there were some of us that voted against the no excuse absentee voting resolution to go to the voters. And the reason why we did is because we don't believe that the full story is being told to the voters in the form of the question. And we're going to debate early voting, I understand, later today possibly, and that is just one step ahead of this process where we are on no excuse absentee voting, and we'll certainly talk about the issues with the questions and the lack of information that the voters have when they're casting their ballot. So before I get really going on the bill, I want to just start by talking about, in response to my good friend, the chairman of the Government Administration and Election Committee's opening comments. She started by saying that Connecticut has some of the strictest election laws in the country. And I disagree with that. That comes from maybe listing all of the different types of voting access that are available in different states. And certainly, because Connecticut does not quite yet have early voting, although it looks like that's about to happen, and we don't have in our Constitution a provision for no excuse absentee voting, some might say that our voting laws are stricter. Well, that may be true if you're only talking about the provisions for the type of voting. But I would argue that in many respects, we have some of the loosest voting laws in the entire country. We have no requirement for photo identification. We have very little requirements for absentee balloting in the state. No provisions restricting who can obtain and send them out. We have no signature verification process. We have no photo identification process for absentee ballots either. And a multitude of other things that I have always found concerning. As I mentioned, we did not get to 75% last time. And we don't need to get to 75% today for this to happen. So I'm not going to take as much time as I did in the previous debate because it's more or less a foregone conclusion that we will reach that 50% plurality today. But it is very important that I stand up and get certain things on the record. And if there is a reason why it didn't get to 75% and end up on the ballot in 2 years ago, it is simply because the majority has failed time and time again to work with the minority on any sort of compromise whatsoever on this bill and on early voting. The battle is always about access versus the integrity of the vote. That's where we debate all of the time. And the majority is very good at wanting to expand access to voting. As I said, we're here discussing no excuse voting. We're going to be talking about early voting later. The thing is that I am more than happy to work with them on expanding access to voting, except at the same time that you expand access to voting, you have to remember there is a requirement to maintain the security and integrity of the vote. The good chairman, when she was speaking, she, besides saying that we have strict election laws and it's the most restrictive in the country, et cetera, she also mentioned that we have a very precious right to vote. And I couldn't agree more. the fact that the right to vote is so precious, and the fact that each one of us cherishes our ability to cast votes in elections to determine who's going to represent us, means that those votes have to matter. We have to be able to trust those votes without question. We have to be able to say, I know that election was fair. I trust the result. But I don't have to tell anyone listening that in America, over the last 10 years or so, we have seen a very steep decline in the trust for elections. In 2016, the Clinton campaign said that the Trump campaign was involved in Russian collusion. Even some representatives in our Connecticut government are on the record saying the same things at the time. We're finding out much of that isn't true. But it doesn't really matter whether it is or it isn't. What matters is that there was doubt in the minds of the voters in 2016 about who really won that election. And that just can't be. And in 2020, President Trump, running for re-election, lost that election, and he said that there was funny business in a number of states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona. I don't remember all of them. And I don't know the answer to that question either. I don't really know what happened in any of those states. It's not my area of expertise. I haven't done the research to know exactly what's happened there. But either way, what really matters is that the people in our country are doubting the election results. And you saw it in those two cases. In one case in 2016, it was the Democrats that doubted the outcome of the election. And in 2020, it was the Republicans that doubted the outcome of the election. Neither is good. What we want is for the people in our country to trust the results of elections and never, ever think for 1 second that something was lost, something was missed, or something that was nefarious occurred. And that's what concerns me about this provision that is before us. I want to point out, by the way, that this may be the 10th time in the last several years that I have debated a significant election law in this chamber. We've debated, just a few days ago, we debated the Voting Rights Act issue. We've debated early voting once already here, but also in the committee process. This is our second time around on no excuse voting. We also had the issue with voting during the COVID pandemic. We had the redefining of the words in the Constitution. The Constitution was the same for 90 plus years, but yet we debated and redefined words in the Constitution just a year ago. And sadly, the result of all of those debates ended up on more or less party line votes. This, Mr. President, is a symptom. It is a symptom of what I just mentioned. It is a symptom of the lack of trust. Now, there are lots and lots of issues that each of us in the circle may agree or disagree with one another about. And that's fine. That's how our system is supposed to work. If we all agree, there'd be no reason to even be here. The fact of the matter is we here all come with our best foot forward in an attempt to try and represent our constituents and put their ideas forward, and we debate them. And hopefully the right policies win the day. But when we vote on election policy, it is very frustrating to have that come out as a party line vote, because we're not debating policy from a standpoint of left or right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. We're talking about the rules of the game that we use to choose who's going to win an election. That's what that's about. And there's really no reason why we shouldn't be able to sit down and negotiate and come up with a bipartisan compromise on the rules of the game. And if there's anything I'd like to convey to people today who are watching this, that's my frustration. I'm going to vote no at the end of this debate, Mr. President, but I'm not against no excuse absentee voting. What I am against is no excuse absentee voting without the proper protections in place. And over the years, in committee and in this room, I have offered countless amendments. Literally, I mean, lots and lots of amendments. It would take you time to add them up. I printed it out. It's multiple sheets of paper, the number of amendments that I have offered on these similar type of election bills, all in an attempt to find compromise so that we could all come together and pass a unanimous vote on how we were going to do no excuse absentee voting or how we were going to do early voting. But it's not happened. And it's not happened because the majority has never felt the slightest desire to meet me in the middle, to come and say, yes, Rob, I understand you represent a lot of people too, and so do your other Republican colleagues. Let's work together to come up with something that we all can agree on. It's always been, we have the votes, we're going to do it our way. And that's what this is. I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the concerns I have about doing the bill in the way that we're doing it. The first thing I want to say before I say anything is that of all the times that we have debated absentee voting, this is the time I'm the least frustrated. And the reason why is because at least this time, we are trying to do no excuse absentee voting through the front door. Because in recent years, it's been done through the back door. Effectively, we already have no excuse absentee voting in Connecticut. Everyone in this room knows it. Everyone in the public knows it. In fact, many elected representatives, the current Secretary of the State during their campaigns, all of them have mentioned that we have no excuse absentee voting in the state because effectively we have. We have operated as if we have no excuse absentee voting in the state. And we should not have, Mr. President, because that would be in direct contradiction to our state constitution. It also makes one scratch their head and wonder why we're even here, since we've been going along doing that for so long. So I'm just going to give you a quick preview of my concerns, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper into them. The number one thing is that the ballot question itself, I think, is vague. It leaves a lot out of the minds of voters. The question that will be offered if this resolution passes today is, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to permit the General Assembly to allow each voter to vote by absentee ballot? It's a perfectly innocuous question, and it mostly does the job. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell voters what the intricate details of no excuse absentee voting are and why they matter. I had an amendment that I was going to call, and that amendment basically says, shall the Constitution be amended to remove restrictions concerning absentee ballots and to permit a person to vote without appearing at a polling place on the day of an election? Because I think that's much more specific to the issue and much more straightforward as a question to be asking the voters so that they truly understand what they're voting for. And I feel like this question that is in the bill that is before us, and certainly when we begin our conversation on early voting, that question was extremely misleading to the voters. So that leads me to the next question, or the next issue that I have beyond that, which is that I can't offer amendments today. I've been advised that amendments are not allowed on this particular resolution because this is a second time go-round on a constitutional amendment question. And let me just say that I find that disheartening, and I also don't believe it. And I know that it's really the rule because we had the same exact conversation a year or two ago when we did it for early voting. And of course, I tried to offer an amendment, and I was challenged on that subject, and it was put to the chair. And of course, that ultimately results in a vote. And of course, if you're in the minority and you're challenging the chair on a subject and a ruling, chances are you're going to lose. I don't want to cast aspersions about whether the ruling is right or wrong. I just want to make one point, and that is that we are the legislative body. That's what we do here. We are the state Senate. We write the laws, right? So the idea that somehow we could not change this is absurd. And I guarantee you that if the majority wanted to change this, they could change it all day long. And no amount of challenges from the minority would make that come out differently. So it's frustrating because more important than anything else for me would be to be able to inject into this bill some of the provisions that I think would improve it to the point where everyone in this room and in the House of Representatives could feel comfortable supporting it. And right now, we're not there. And then finally, the thing that matters most to me is one of those changes. And that is that by updating our Constitution to reflect no excuse absentee voting, you are opening a giant door to ballot harvesting, to mail-in voting, and to the things that have brought rise to those contested elections across the country, the concerns that we heard in 2016 and 2020. And I don't want those problems in our state. And there are ways to fix it. There are ways to do this where we will not have those problems. So let me ask a few questions through you, Mr. President.
Please proceed, Senator Sampson.
Thank you. I guess the first question I would ask is, what is the purpose of this bill? Through you.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Mr. President, I hesitate to be corrective, is perhaps the politest way to say it, but this is a resolution and not a bill. And the purpose of the resolution is to amend the state's constitution to allow for no excuse absentee voting and put this question to the voters of the state of Connecticut as is the next step in the process for amending our constitution. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Flexer. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I appreciate the correction. It is a resolution. I think that most people would consider a resolution to still be a bill, but that's besides the point. The issue really for me is, and it was instructive from the question, from the response, which is that we are merely asking the question of the voters on whether or not they would like to see the Constitution modified to allow for no excuse absentee voting. But that doesn't mean that we will automatically have no excuse absentee voting, does it? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the current constructs of our state constitution place some limitations on the use of absentee ballots. And so for expanded access to absentee ballot voting, there would also need to be a complementary change in our state statutes.
Thank you, Senator Flexer. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate that answer. So very clearly, what needs to happen is even if this passes today and it goes to the voters and it ends up on the ballot in the next election, if it passes affirmatively, the legislature will still have to meet to pass legislation, to write statutes, to make the policy effectively for no excuse absentee voting in Connecticut. I would just ask the good chairman, through you, Mr. President, she mentioned that we would be expanding our absentee balloting process from what it is currently. And I'm curious to know in what way that is. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Flexer.
Through you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the current state constitution lists out a number of reasons why a voter may vote via absentee ballot. As the good senator referenced earlier in the debate on this bill, those exemptions were expanded to be so that there was alignment between our statutory language and the language in the Constitution. If this language that is posed in this resolution were to change our state's constitution, those excuses that are currently outlined in the Constitution would be eliminated from the language of the Constitution. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Flexer. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate that answer very much. So that begs a question. who will have the ability to vote by absentee ballot that was not allowed to have absentee voting in the previous election? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Flexer.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this resolution before us would not change that. It would change the language in our Constitution, so there would be no change in the statutory language until and if the voters approve this resolution, which would amend the Constitution and then give us the authority to expand the language in our statutes beyond what already aligns with the language in our Constitution.
Thank you, Senator Flexer. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I appreciate that answer. I guess what I'm driving at is trying to understand under our current law, which we can talk about in some detail if we want. I was hoping to avoid that. I might have to go through that just to get us to a point where we can have this conversation. But in my experience, over the last couple of years, ever since July of 2020, when an exception was made to mail absentee ballot applications to every voter on the voter rolls in the state by the Secretary of the State, every person in the state of Connecticut who was an active voter according to the list was entitled to vote by absentee ballot. And I am just curious, if that's the case, that seems to me that everyone is eligible. And now we have a resolution before us that proposes to put a question to the voters, should we make everyone eligible? And I'm just wondering why that is. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, through you, as the good senator knows, we've had a lot of debate around the statutory language and the language in our Constitution with regard to absentee balloting. And so I would argue that this resolution is before us both so that it is crystal clear who can cast their ballot via no excuse absentee balloting, so that it would no longer be subject to debate potentially, and so that the legislature could outline a different process, a broader process potentially, so that the General Assembly would have access to changing our state statutes with regard to the use of absentee ballots beyond the areas that have been the subject of great debate over the last several years, things like sickness and absence from the town, et cetera. We would be able to have a debate beyond those measures. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Flexer. Senator Sampson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. I sincerely appreciate that answer. That was very well done by my colleague over there. And she's correct. There has been significant debate, and I'm responsible for some of it, for sure, because over the last several years, it is my opinion that the type of voting that has taken place in the state of Connecticut was not lawful or constitutional. And I understand that there have been numerous machinations, I guess I would call them, to try and justify it after the fact. But in July of 2020, we came in here to make a policy effectively that was in direct contradiction with the state constitution, expanding the idea that anyone who had COVID or was concerned with getting COVID would somehow be eligible for an absentee ballot. And in point of fact, for 90 some odd years that the state constitution has included provisions for absentee balloting, it's always been interpreted to mean the individual in question's sickness. And yet, maybe it was because of the time, maybe it was because of the desire to do something in a time of crisis, this body saw fit to go ahead and put a blessing kind of after the fact on the Secretary of State's actions of sending out those ballot applications to all the voters on the voter rolls and suggesting on the form that any person could check the box for COVID, which I still say is in direct contradiction to the state constitution. There was a legal challenge brought, as a matter of fact, and ultimately the Supreme Court in the state of Connecticut decided, against my view, that the word sickness in the Constitution always meant any sickness whatsoever. But if you follow along with me here for a moment, you'll realize that when you simply say sickness and not a specific person's sickness, now you've opened the door to everyone becoming eligible. And I guess that was the whole idea to begin with. Now, as I mentioned before, I should be appreciative today because at least the resolution that is before us is trying to do this the right way. Through the front door, say, yes, we're going to just remove those restrictions and enable no excuse absentee voting for everyone. And as I said from the outset, I'm not opposed to that. I like the idea, and I do think that people should be able to vote by absentee regardless of the circumstances. It gets a little convoluted when you understand that we are doing so many other things, though. We are expanding early voting. I understand that the bill we're going to debate later is going to give us an additional 14 days of voting. We already have 45 days of absentee voting, and that's expanded now to include everyone being eligible on the notion of the definition of sickness. So we're opening things wide open. And I guess my frustration is that you can't have it both ways. You cannot say the Constitution always meant illness so broadly that it creates no excuse absentee voting, but then why would they list the excuses? And then why are we here passing a law to say it doesn't mean that, because now we have to do a much broader constitutional amendment? And in my opinion, I guess, is that we're doing this for one reason, which is to expand voting yet again and expand access, which, again, I have no issue with, except that we should be doing it the right way. But number two, it's also to legitimize all that has been done so far. And it's not a secret that the state is operating as though we already have no excuse absentee voting. The big issue for me, as I mentioned, is voting by mail. So through you, Madam President, sorry to get you up, but I would just like to ask whether or not, if this resolution passes, and then the question goes to the voters and they pass it with a plurality, will the legislature be able to write a policy for no excuse absentee voting that allows mail-in voting? Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Flexer.
Good evening, Madam President. Nice to see you up there.
Good evening.
Madam President, if this resolution were passed by the State Senate this evening and approved by the voters of Connecticut in the November 2024 general election, it would remove the existing restrictions in our state's constitution with regard to no excuse absentee voting. And so there could be changes in our state statutes with regard to how voters use absentee ballots. Mail-in voting could potentially be a part of that, but that would be up to the General Assembly that is seated after November of 2024. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I appreciate that answer. So there you have it. That is the main concern that I have. And what we've seen is back during the COVID pandemic, we saw the state of Connecticut, at great expense, by the way, spend the money to send out absentee ballot applications to every voter on the voter rolls in the state of Connecticut. And there were major issues with that. I'll just go through them quickly. It cost $7.1 million. It also, the figures show that out of the ballots applications that were sent, 8% of them were returned undeliverable in the primary, a total of around 100,000, and then in the general election, about 184,000 of them were returned. And this just asks a lot of questions. It begs a lot of questions. How many people didn't get their ballot application? How many people voted via that process and then their ballot showed up after Election Day? And there were a great number of them. I have some concerns about trying to move our voting process away from the way it's been traditionally done, where people vote on one specific day in person. There's a simple mechanism for counting. Now, with all these different aspects of voting, what you end up with is many different counts. You have the count for people who voted in person. You have the count for the early voters. You have the count for the absentee voters. You have the count for the people that did same-day registration. You have the count for the people that have provisional ballots. You go on and on and on. With all of these different numbers that need to be put together to come up with an election. And it just leads to potential problems, and I have a concern about that. And I think people are confused. I think that's one real concern I have about all of this, is I think that people are confused. During the previous election, people were receiving multiple ballot applications because they were getting one from the Republican candidate, they were getting one from the Democrat candidate, they were getting one from some third party who wanted to support a specific candidate. This disenfranchises people because you just know that the Republican candidate is going to create a list of people that they feel confident are going to support them in the election. And that's who they send the ballot applications to. They're certainly not sending them to people that are known to oppose their candidacy. And the Democrats will do the same. So you end up with a situation where you have voters receiving ballot applications from numerous places, and they're also receiving them only if they are apparently a voter that leans in one direction or the other, and people know it. My concern is that the people that are not obvious Republicans or Democrats, they're the ones that are going to be ignored. Oh, that guy's not on my list. I'm not sending him a ballot. And then the other guy says the same thing, and there you go. So we end up disenfranchising people by creating this system. And we saw it in the last election. We saw all campaigns across this state mailing ballot applications like crazy to people, and also sending out companion mail to say, yes, you can check the box for sickness. You can vote by absentee. It was a mess, Madam President, in no uncertain terms. It was a mess. And I'm afraid that that's where we're headed here. I've got so many notes here. We can have so many conversations about the various types of protections that we've attempted to put into the no excuse absentee voting conversation that have failed. Everything from drop boxes. We had a big debate over whether or not we would have drop boxes in elections and where they would be placed, and whether or not we would have surveillance checking those drop boxes. Whether or not we actually have the right laws in place to guarantee that the custody and control of the ballots leaving the drop box make it to the right place. Whether or not we have the right policy in place about how people who assist others in casting their ballot in a nursing home or something like that. All of these things are still up in the air, Madam President. I have tried over the last several years to get movement from the majority on these items that have to do with the integrity and security of elections, and yet those things are the things that have been ignored. Yes, we want to expand voting. We want to make it easier for people to vote. I'm right there with you. And I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to stand here and to say, I support no excuse absentee voting, but if we're going to do it, we ought to do it by saying that the only person that can get a ballot application is somebody who asks for one. If that provision was adopted by the majority, you'd have a unanimous vote. Because that would solve the number one issue that I have, and I know others have as well. And if we're being honest about it, if we're truly being honest, and we don't want to have problems, and we don't want to have a Russian collusion election or the big lie election anymore. We want to get rid of that stuff. We want to end those conversations. The way to do it is to do it right. The way to do it is to say, yes, we'll do no excuse absentee voting, but we will include the proper protections to make sure that we don't have problems going forward. And I'm not the only one that feels that way. Even folks in the majority in this chamber have been quoted around the room numerous times on the subject of absentee ballots. Senator Looney himself, and this was a few years ago, I think this was in 2019, during the debate on early voting. Obviously, he was supportive of that, but I pulled up the text of his remarks on the floor that day, and he said, and I think that is legitimately controversial, because in reality, we never really know for sure who is casting an absentee ballot. That's not me saying that. That's Senator Looney, the most powerful person in this building. We hope it's the person to whom it was sent. We believe in most cases it is, but we don't actually know. These are his words. And so that is an issue. If we open up absentee balloting for the convenience of those who are ill or disabled or out of state on a given day, but obviously the number of absentee ballot cases of fraud that we had over the years well documents the flaws in that system. So I wonder, why have we changed our tune so far? Why doesn't those words matter anymore? I think the last time we voted on this, I think there was one other person that voted no on it, and that was my colleague, Senator Bradley, at the time from Bridgeport, a Democrat, and he gave quite a speech on the floor about his experience with absentee ballots. And I'll just read a little part of that statement. He goes, and that experience is that very oftentimes there is a manipulation, a trickery, and a full-out deception with the absentee ballot process. Again, this is not me. This was a Democrat senator who sat in this chamber with us just a couple of years ago. And I think that many of my colleagues, particularly ones that serve in city districts, can relate to this. He goes on to say, it is the reason why in my great city of Bridgeport, which I love to the depth of my bones, is oftentimes labeled as corrupt. They talk about candidacy as recently as the candidacy of our great Senator Marilyn Moore, who ran against Joe Ganim, who won every single polling place and lost due to absentee ballots. He goes on to say, and I'll give you an experience that I personally had. When I was a younger person, I ran for a particular seat in the legislature and lost. And I recapped to see where exactly I lost. And I went back to a particular place where I saw 64 people voted out of the same house. And I said, that must be an apartment complex or a housing project or a senior center, or that must be a place where there's some sort of, no building there. It was a vacant lot. It was an abandoned vacant lot with a mailbox. And I saw across the street there was a building there at one point. He said, no, there hasn't been a building there for years. Anyway, this is kind of long. I don't want to go through the whole thing. You get the idea. You get the idea that people know that there are problems with expanding mail-in voting, with sending out unsolicited absentee ballot applications. There are problems with our voter rolls. That's on my list of amendments that have never been adopted year after year. Please, let's fix the voter rolls. Nope. We don't want to fix the voter rolls. We don't want to correct that. We just want to continue sending out those ballot applications, as many as we possibly can. It's a mess, Madam President, and people in this room know it, in both parties. We have the opportunity to do it better. And I am so hopeful, Madam President, and my goal here today is only one thing. It is just one thing. I know how this vote's going to go. I get it. I understand, but we're going to be back here, and we're going to be trusted to make the policy for no excuse absentee voting going forward. And I don't want anyone to forget this conversation. I want us to remember that when we do it, we have to do it right. We have to fix it. We have to put in protections. We have to end the ballot harvesting. We have to stop that nonsense. We have to come up with a way to clean our voting rolls so people trust that the information is correct. We need to find a way to not have any more party line votes on election policy, the rules of the game, as I mentioned. We need to come up with solutions that work for everyone, where we agree that the election is fair and we trust it. So we don't have people at the highest offices in our country arguing with each other saying that the election was stolen. But until we start having those conversations, it's going to continue. And the great divide in our country is going to continue too. And that's wrong. There's nothing I'd like better than to be able to say that we are putting a policy before the people of Connecticut that I know is going to be trustworthy and honest. We're going to vote on the policy portion of early voting later today, presumably. And that's the policy that is being adopted after it's gone through the same process we're discussing here, where it's gone through the constitutional amendment process, where we had to vote in the legislature and get it through twice at 50%, and then it had to go to the ballot, and the voters had to support it and so forth. But now that one's actually here to debate the policy. And let me tell you, my experience on that, I'm going to tell you about later today, is that all of the same concerns I had about the security and the integrity of the vote, they've been ignored and ignored and ignored and ignored and ignored. And I've offered the same amendments trying to fix it year after year after year. They are voted down on party line votes. So my trust level is at 0, Madam President, to suggest that somehow I'm going to be like, oh, well, let's just put this before the voters, and when it comes back here, I know the majority is going to take all of my words of wisdom, and they're going to try and put in protections to make sure we don't have ballot harvesting in Bridgeport. But they're not. Sorry to get on my soapbox there. I think I've about covered the issues with this. We should put a better question in front of the voters of Connecticut. We should allow amendments today on this because we are the state Senate. I know that if the majority wanted to amend this bill, we could. I will remind everyone that if we had actually worked together 2 years ago, we would have got over the 75% threshold. We would have probably got to 100%, and we would have no excuse absentee voting today. So imagine my frustration when I read in the newspaper that Senator Sampson led the attack on no excuse absentee voting. And it'll probably say that tomorrow too. But it's not true. The reason why we don't have no excuse absentee voting today is not because of me. It is because of the majority. It's because of the majority refusing to work with the minority on anything of any substance at all. To come to us and say, yes, that is at least a good idea that doesn't cost us anything, but will help maintain the security and integrity of the election. So if you're a reporter watching this, or you're someone who's going to watch this and tell the story, please understand, if we put in something in this bill right now that says we're not going to have ballot harvesting, that we're going to only send absentee ballot applications to legitimate voters after we fix the voter rolls, I would vote for it. I would be the first one to jump up and down and cheerlead for it. But that's not what's going to happen. Nothing's going to be done about our voter rolls. And I encourage you, if you're watching now, to stay tuned, because when we vote on early voting, I can offer amendments there, and I will be offering those amendments. And you can watch how those votes turn out, and whether or not the majority actually wants to work with the minority to come up with good election policy for the state of Connecticut in a bipartisan way to establish the rules of the game in a fair way. I hope I'm wrong. I really do. I hope that I'm surprised today. I hope that we find common ground. I hope that we find a way to work together so that we can show President Trump and President Biden and Hillary Clinton the right way to do things, instead of pointing fingers and say the election was stolen, blah, blah. No. Let's actually write a policy together where we both say, you know what, those are good ideas. Let's do this the right way. Let's make sure everybody's happy and confident in the result of the election. I hope, and I will continue to hope. But for now, Madam President, I'm going to vote no on the resolution because I don't see it. My last final words will be, please, if you're a Democrat in this chamber, if you're a Republican in this chamber, when we come back after this is voted on by the voters, please, please take these warnings to heart. If we do not do this right, we will make a large mistake. We will have less trust in our elections, and we will have even a more divided country. Thank you.